The Empress Wanrong was a tragic figure. Independent and artistic, her life was cast into a ruinous downward spiral in 1922 when she married Puyi, the last emperor of China. Between the early 1930s and 1945, she and her husband became the emperor and empress of the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo. But beyond the facade of imperial rule was a young woman with a chronic opium addiction, which would eventually kill her. The woman who has become known to history as the Empress Wanrong was born on the 13th of November 1906 as Gobulu Wanrong. The name Wanrong means beautiful countenance. She was born into the Gobulo clan under the plain white banner of the 8 banners into which society was divided in Manchuria, the northeast part of China, which today lies between North Korea and Russia. The members of the White Plain Banner formed part of the upper class of Manchurian society, and Wanrong's father, Rong Yuan, served as a minister for domestic affairs in the government of Qing dynasty China towards the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. Rong Yuan was also one of China's wealthiest individuals at the time of Wanrong's birth. Wanrong's early life was somewhat tragic. Her mother, Heng Xin, died after giving birth to Wanrong from childbed fever or postpartum infection. Consequently, the young Wanrong was largely raised by her stepmother, Heng Xiang. She had 2 brothers, one called Runlian, who was her full brother and had been born to her mother Heng Xing before Wanrong herself was born. The second was her stepbrother, Runqi. Wanrong's father was a progressive man for his time in the late imperial China. He believed his daughter should be afforded the same educational opportunities as Rongliang and Runqi were given. Accordingly, she was taught at a missionary school in Tianjin by Isabel Ingram, an American teacher who taught her to speak English and many Western cultural pursuits, such as how to play the piano and to paint. Wanrong's early years were a time of enormous change in China. The country had been ruled by the Qing dynasty since 1644. However, the country began to experience enormous challenges from the 18th century onwards, as European traders and armies began arriving with far superior technology. China was one of the few countries in the world which did not fall under direct European rule in the 19th century, but Britain effectively forced the country to become a mass market for opium, which it was producing in India. Then, in the late 19th century, Japan began to adopt Western technology and practices very quickly. This rapid modernization of Japan and the expansion of Russian influence in East Asia placed China under pressure from its neighbor. The situation was compounded by growing internal domestic problems in China. A mass movement for social and political reform had emerged by the first years of the 20th century. Then, in 1908, just 2 years after Wanrong's birth, the Guangxu Emperor Zetian died. He was succeeded by his 2-year-old nephew, the Emperor Puyi. This rule by an infant, as China was facing an internal crisis, was disastrous. In October 1911, what is known as the Wuchang Rising broke out across 14 of the 15 provinces into which China was divided at the time. As a result, within weeks the Qing dynasty was forced to abdicate, and a new Republic of China was established. However, it was just the beginning of a long and bitter civil war which would eventually rage on for nearly 40 years. Despite the establishment of the Republic, the Qing imperial family was still allowed to keep their titles and privileges within China, though they could no longer rule the country. In 1922, the deposed Emperor Puyi, by now a teenager of 16 years of age, had determined to marry and was given permission to do so within the confines of the Forbidden City in Beijing, the ancient residence of the Chinese emperors. To select his first bride, the former emperor was shown 5 photos of 5 potential candidates. One of these was none other than the former Minister of Domestic Affairs' daughter, Wanrong, who was the same age as Puyi. In the end, Puyi selected her amongst the 5 candidates, though not until after some further wrangling about which candidate should be chosen. They eventually married in the Forbidden City on the 30th of November 1922. Meanwhile, as this occurred, China was entering a new stage of its civil war, with the growth of the Chinese Communist movement. Wanrong appears to have been very hesitant about marrying Puyi, an independent woman with her own thoughts. She did not wish to be confined to the Forbidden City, with its archaic imperial rituals. It is perhaps unsurprising to learn that her marriage to the last emperor became deeply unhappy. They did not have children and would often not engage with each other for prolonged periods of time. She found solace in other pursuits. Wanrong wrote poetry, was a painter, and also engaged in charitable endeavours. When famine struck China in 1923, she donated a sizable sum of money towards relief efforts, an action which gained her praise in the international media. However, increasingly, Wanrong's method of dealing with her unhappy domestic and marital life was through less sanguine pursuits. She started smoking opium at this time, at first perhaps to deal with headaches and anxiety, but her usage gradually became habitual. In October 1924, as the growing civil war throughout China worsened, power in Beijing was seized by the army commander Feng Yuxiang. On the 5th of November, he issued a command that the former emperor and his imperial household were no longer to be allowed to reside in the Forbidden City. They were expelled from the palace that night, and after staying at some intermediate houses, eventually settled at Tianjin, to the southeast of Beijing on the Yellow Sea coast. For a while, they lived here in some degree of harmony, having abandoned the trappings of their imperial past, and by westernizing their names to Henry and Elizabeth. However, Wanrong's opium addiction continued to deteriorate even further. In the early 1930s, their lives changed drastically. In September 1931, the armies of Imperial Japan took advantage of the seemingly endless civil wars in China and invaded the Manchuria region in the northeast of the country, Wanrong's ancestral homeland. Japan had been in control of Korea since 1910 and now wanted to incorporate Manchuria into its growing empire. The result was a swift military campaign. By February 1932, the Japanese were fully in control of Manchuria, but rather than annexing it directly into the Japanese Empire, a decision was taken to establish a puppet regime here. Thus, the Japanese authorities now approached Puyi and in February 1932 installed him as the head of the new puppet state named Manchukuo. Early in 1934, Puyi and Wanrong would have their titles elevated to become Emperor and Empress of Manchukuo. The couple's life as rulers of Manchukuo became highly troubled. Their movements were closely monitored and controlled by the Japanese authorities. Puyi became a devout Buddhist, spending much of his time in meditation and reading. Meanwhile, Wanrong took to acquiring dogs and making dresses. Also, her opium habit had spiraled into reportedly smoking 2 ounces of opium per day. During an extended stay in Japan, she had several affairs. One of these resulted in the birth of an illegitimate daughter. This may have been the catalyst for Wanrong's additional descent into addiction. When the Japanese authorities learned that the baby was not Puyi's, a decision was taken to kill the girl, despite Wanrong's pleadings. In the aftermath, Wanrong's opium use increased further. She was now said to act quite erratically at the imperial palace, would binge eat, and was often not presentable at official functions, owing to her chronic opium habit. Contemporary records recount how her father found it difficult to visit her by this point. Well, her condition continued to worsen. Thus, for all the emperor and empress were presented to the world as the official faces of the state of Manchukuo, Behind closed doors, their lives were deteriorating to an enormous extent, trapped by the Japanese government, whose offer to renew their imperial titles they had accepted. In the end, much as the current of Chinese politics had brought about Puyi's removal as Emperor of China in 1911 and the enforced exile of the couple from Beijing in 1924, it was international events which eventually brought about their ruin in Manchukuo. In 1939, the Second World War had broken out in Europe. Then, late in 1941, Japan had gone to war with the United States by attacking Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Within weeks, they were also at war with America's new allies, Britain, France, and Soviet Russia. Although victorious at first, and able to expand into Indochina and even northeast India, the Japanese were pushed back into the Pacific from 1943 onwards. The end came in the summer and autumn of 1945. In early August, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. Simultaneously, the Soviets invaded the puppet state of Manchukuo. When they did, Puyi fled, leaving behind his wife. Wanrong now entered the last desperate period of her life. Early in 1946, while attempting to escape over the border to Korea, she was captured by the armies of the Chinese Communists, who were gradually seizing power all over China in the post-war period. In the months that followed, Wanrong and her few followers were moved between several prisons in Jilin province. During this time, her condition was deteriorating rapidly. She had entered severe opium withdrawals, having been cut off from any supplies of the drug, and was suffering from regular hallucinations and physical problems. Consequently, the first wife of the last Emperor of China died from withdrawal and malnutrition on the 20th of June 1946 at the age of 39. Following her death, she was memorialized as Empress Xiaokemin, though her body was never recovered, and the monument, dedicated to her near Beijing today, is a purely ceremonial tomb. Well, her body is not entombed there. Her husband Puyi was arrested himself and would go on to spend 10 years in prison under the Chinese Communists. He married 4 more times in later life, and in 1964 wrote an autobiography. This latter work formed the basis of The Last Emperor, a film directed by Bernardo Bertolucci, which won 9 Academy Awards in 1987, immortalizing the story of Puyi and Wanrong, the Emperor and Empress of Manchukuo. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on the Empress Wanrong. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, leave me a comment down below, and if you're new, why not subscribe? Please make sure to have your notifications turned on so you get all my videos as soon as they're uploaded, and if you have any suggestions, you can send it to my email or Instagram, which are both found in the description. That's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks!